I'm Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today, and this is Capital Download. We're at the Brookings Institution with the former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pifer. Thanks so much for being with us.
Happy to be here.
The crisis between Ukraine and Russia is continuing. There are reports today that Russian military forces are gathering near the Ukraine border. Is this worrisome?
It causes a little bit of tension, but I think that the Russian military would have to think really hard about going into eastern Ukraine, because I think there's then a very high probability that at least some Ukrainian military units would fight, and they would then end up in a shooting war.
We expect to see a referendum in Crimea about annexation to Russia on Sunday. Will that go forward, that vote?
There's no doubt that the referendum is going to go forward, and it's pretty much a given that the box that will be checked by most people will be to join Russia. The interesting question then is, what do the Russians do? And I think they have really two real choices. One choice would be to move outright to annex Ukraine, and then it becomes very apparent this is just an outright Russian land grab. And that would be unfortunate, because if Russia annexes Crimea, there's no chance it's ever going back to Ukraine. But that would also be the option most likely to promote a very hard Western response. The alternative is that the Russians note that, but Ukraine stays in something of a limbo status, which might create a little bit of bargaining room.
Well, as you mentioned, the Secretary of State, John Kerry, has been sent by President Obama to London to meet with his Russian counterpart on Friday. But does Russia seem interested in getting a diplomatic solution?
Unfortunately, so far not yet. I mean, the administration has been very careful since this crisis blew up 10 days ago to leave what they call a diplomatic off-ramp for Russia, a way to get to a negotiating path. The stumbling block so far is that Russia refuses to deal with the government in Ukraine. And until you have that dialogue going, it's going to be hard to find some kind of a solution.
So if the referendum goes forward in Crimea, President Obama said Wednesday when he met with the interim president of Ukraine that the world would completely reject a slapdash election and there would be a cost for Russia. What would be the cost for Russia?
Well, there's already, I think, you've seen a number of steps taken. For example, the other 7 members of the G8 unanimously agreed to stop preparing to go to the G8 summit in Sochi. My guess is that the G8 mechanism itself is somewhat at risk now, that if the Russians continue this action, at some point the other 7 are going to say, we don't need a G8, we're going to go back to the G7 that we had in the 1990s. The United States has already terminated, for example, negotiations on a bilateral investment treaty, halted all military exercises, and begun to impose some visa sanctions on targeted individuals. And they're working up the mechanisms for further steps, including, for example, broader financial sanctions.
But there are costs to the United States as well with these steps. We've been trying to cultivate relations with Russia to deal with things like money laundering and organized crime.
But I think the perception in Washington, not only in Washington, it's also in Europe, is that Vladimir Putin, by this military occupation of Crimea, has violated the rules of the game. Since 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, borders were seen to be sacrosanct. And this kind of blatant grab is just really, you haven't seen this in the last 25 years.
Is this a new Cold War coming?
We certainly are headed for perhaps the rockiest period in U.S.-Russia relations since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Unless the Russians change course, we're going to be in for a pretty difficult time, unfortunately.
You know, here's what some Russians might say. They might say, well, the United States now says that these borders are sacrosanct, but there have been other cases in modern times where the United States has stood up for self-determination of peoples. So is there an element of hypocrisy here by the United States?
Well, the case the Russians will cite to us is they'll say Kosovo. And let's take Kosovo as a case. I mean, in the end, Kosovo made a unilateral declaration of independence, which the United States recognized and 100 other countries recognized. But that only came after 10 years of negotiations with Serbia. So there was an effort by Kosovo to see if they could work out a separation in a way that would be agreeable to Serbia, and that ultimately failed. In this case, you're talking about a situation that really is only not even in its second week, and you have Crimea, I think, very much with the backing and the prompting of Moscow pushing this kind of referendum. And it's really, the cases aren't comparable at all.
Why should Americans care about this? Why should this be the subject of concern for Americans?
Well, let me give you 3 quick reasons. First of all, if this spins out of control, it's going to be a big issue for Europe. We're going to get pulled in one way or the other. And so getting involved now to try to contain it may save us a lot of energy, time, and expense down the road. Second, it's important that the West and the United States show to Vladimir Putin that there are consequences for this. We don't want him to conclude that he can break the rules like this and then do it elsewhere. And then third, in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine had on its territory the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world. And they gave that up at our urging, in part because we extended, along with the Russians and the British, security assurances to respect Ukrainian independence, their territorial integrity. And that was part of the price to get rid of 1,900 nuclear weapons targeted at the United States. We have an obligation to basically help them politically and diplomatically and economically now. And it's not just about Ukraine, but if you look at the nuclear proliferation challenges in North Korea or Iran, security assurances might be some part of those solutions. We can't, if we discredit the security assurances we gave in 1994, though, we take that tool out of the diplomatic toolbox.
That's an area you're an expert in. You're now director of the Brookings Arms Control and Non-Proliferation Initiative. And I wondered, sort of another aspect of this, the reports the Kremlin is considering suspending the inspections of its own strategic nuclear arsenal as a result of this crisis. How serious a step would that be?
That could be a pretty serious step, and I think it would be something that the United States would very much regret. But it's also not in the Russian interest. I mean, the Russians too have an interest in making sure that American strategic nuclear forces be capped. And the 2010 New START Treaty caps both sides. And I think both sides appreciate that limit and also the predictability. So I think there's that threat, but my guess is that the Russians would think long and hard before doing that.
If the annexation of Crimea proceeds and Russia decides to just endure whatever the financial costs might be of that, could that embolden other countries that have disputed claims on territory to think about moving ahead? I'm thinking, for instance, of China.
Certainly, it's in the world's interest to say if there's going to be a territorial dispute like this, it needs to be resolved by negotiation. You don't do what the Russians did, which is just basically take the place over militarily. And we don't want that to become the new norm.
Why do you think Vladimir Putin has done this?
It's not just about Crimea. I think what the Russians are about here and what Mr. Putin's about is he wants to have a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, and Ukraine is a very important piece of that. And he's concerned that Ukraine is interested not so much in NATO, but in the European Union and in signing an association agreement with the European Union. So I think Crimea was really a means to an end to try to pressure and destabilize that government. I think in a way, though, it's had an unintended consequence, which is within Ukraine now, I think the population supports even more drawing closer to the European Union.
Where do you think this goes?
The Russians fundamentally have a choice to make. They could choose the diplomatic offer-up, at least get a negotiating process on, which I think would take a long time. It'll be, at best, some time before Ukraine could reassert sovereignty over Crimea, if ever. But that would at least get a negotiating process underway that might find a solution without having a real crisis in Western Russian relations. But if they were to go, for example, the route of annexing Crimea, then I think you will see some fairly stiff Western sanctions, including financial sanctions, applied jointly by the United States and the European Union.
Some Republicans in Congress have said that President Obama opened the door to this action by Russia by not being more forceful in places like Syria. Is that a fair criticism? I
think that's a little bit overstated. I mean, I think that the White House made some mistakes in terms of how it handled Syria, particularly back in August and September. But I think that this is an issue, given the way that Putin looks at it. Regardless of how we would have handled Syria, we probably would have been having this kind of crisis with Russia today.
Ambassador Pfeiffer, thanks so much for joining us on Capitol Download.
Thank you for having me.